Good afternoon. My name is Steve Shea, and I'm an instructor of history at Oregon State University, where I've taught for 13 years. It's a pleasure to be part of the program at this regional Reacting to the Past conference. I especially want to thank Paul Otto and George Fox University for hosting, and to thank all my colleagues at Reacting to the Past who helped prepare this conference. My only sadness is that I'm not there to be with you in person, but I'm thrilled that you will experience firsthand what reacting can do for your classroom. We hope to use technology at the end of my comments to go deeper into the topics that are most relevant to you. I got here by attending a Reacting to the Past conference just like you in the winter of 2014 in Eugene. In that case, we were playing the Greenwich Village game, and I had the character of Hutchins Hapgood, quite a bohemian character who believed in complex marriage and strongly supported unions. For those 2 days, we were immersed in New York City just before World War I. I was an easy convert. In my prior life, I taught middle school in Southern California, and we did a simulation on the Constitutional Convention. The students absolutely loved the experience. For me, it provided a historical reference point for the rest of the year when we discussed politics, decision-making, and the context in the era after the American Revolution and into the early Republic. I knew that I wanted that experience for my college classroom, but I lacked the time to develop anything that wonderful. Reacting is exactly what I had hoped for. These simulations marry elements of the heart and mind in a way that benefits my immediate goals in the classroom and prepares students to be part of a civic society. I've played at least 2 games every quarter since the fall of 2015 with my students. Part of this conference is to share best practices for those who have tried reacting and those who are new to simulations. And I want to apologize in advance because this is going to seem like 2 talks. So I'll start off with how I use reacting to the past, and then I'll conclude with choice in a civic society. Reacting to the past helps me meet my curricular objectives. The use of primary documents, context, complexity are part of the warp and weave of history. But reacting allows me to do more, because the biggest reason why I use reacting is that it introduces contingency of history, the what-if questions, the things that students love to ask about in terms of what would have happened if an event had not occurred or if a person had not been present. And it introduces them to the idea that history is not destiny. Reacting also develops students' soft skills, negotiating, talking with others, meeting with others, that they're going to need in their professional lives, regardless of what their major is. Now, my primary responsibility is teaching U.S. history, but OSU has an additional requirement for their back core, difference, power, and discrimination. And so I see all majors from engineering, education, business, as well as the liberal arts. And all of these students talk about how reacting has helped them to improve as students. Starting off in using reacting, there's plenty of opportunities for support. It's a very helpful community. There are organized conferences like this one. There's also an annual institute in New York City in June, and a winter conference meeting in January where attendees play games, meet the people who designed the games, and hone their skills. And then, of course, there's regional conferences like this one where you can meet great game masters like Paul and Ellie. Another tool that I think is the most useful tool is the Reacting Faculty Lounge on Facebook. This is a closed group on Facebook where instructors can talk about the latest research and studies, where they can get questions answered on unique situations in the game. The lounge makes me feel like I'm part of a group that cares about pedagogy in the classroom and supports one another in their efforts. And once again, there's great game masters like Paul and Ellie posting. Sometimes, however, you want to try something new, and for me it was larger classes. The biggest challenge for me is that I have large classes, 49 to 75 students. And while the games are well designed, many of them are simply not designed for classes that large. And so my solution was to split the class in half, an early session and a late session. Now, I teach twice a week in 2-hour blocks, and so this allows students to simultaneously go through the simulation just in an early session and then a late session. I always wanted to try and emphasize the accountability of students And so I didn't go with the option of having two students play the same character. The other thing that is vital in doing large classes is giving students time. By having my debate last for only an hour and then a day to digest what happened, students can adjust to the events, and it gives students additional time to think. It makes for a more intellectual game. Now, some instructors worry about the rigor of reacting to the past. Well, first, having students responsible for 3 to 4 minute speeches is a difficult task, and I've never heard students say that that was an easy thing to do. Much of the time when students come in to talk about the speeches, they want assurance about their first speech. Now, their roles are well written and clearly lay out what documents they're to use and some of the arguments that they make. But as I emphasize with students, the real gold involved in reacting to the past is the ability for them to react to future situations in the later sessions. Second, my class has rigor because the amount of writing is fairly extensive. Their journal entries from beginning to end result in about 10 pages of writing. The first thing is, of course, is to have a character intro and autobiographical sketch where the student writes this in character. They use primary documents of the era to craft their speeches, and their initial post allows me to see this. Many instructors also include a quiz just before the beginning of the reacting so that they know that students are aware of when the speeches are due, what their roles are, what their factions are, and so forth. Now, I do this early because my classes are so large that I can get the grading done, and during the game I can focus on the students' needs and student meetings. One of the best ways to get everybody on the same page is a rubric and schedule. In this rubric, you can see that I have outlined how written work will be characterized. I evaluate on argument, evidence, analysis, historical context, organization, even timing and delivery. And so students are well aware of the excellence that's required of them in the reacting simulation. Additionally, I share with them a rubric for in-class participation, and that ranges on to page 2, and then a general keeping score element, A, B, C level work, and then a calendar so that they can plan when their speeches are due. You'll notice at the bottom of the rubric that the character objectives are worth 25 points out of 250. I try to keep this low because I don't want it to be the entire game of if they meet their character's objectives, but I also don't want it to be nothing as well. Your next step will be in starting the game, and students will struggle at the start of the game because it's like nothing that they have ever experienced before. And so you should schedule time to have private meetings with your students. One piece of advice that I have is to take particular care of the indeterminate roles, those students that don't necessarily have a side or a clear argument at the beginning of the game. You should also allow for factions to meet before the simulation starts. This will lead to better cohesiveness and esprit de corps within the group and allow them to craft strategies. In fact, even while the simulation is going on, I frequently allow 5 minutes at the start of class for students to strategize. I mean, after all, what meeting really starts on time? And it's a good opportunity to let the game breathe, and you can take care of little issues that you need to as well. While you're running the game, you're going to struggle to stay sane, and I say that in the best possible way. Students will come up with innumerable variations from term to term that will bring new ideas to the forefront. And students also need some visual cues during the game so that they can become more immersed in the characters. This is how I have students get to know each other. I take old manila folders and then I cut them into thirds. Students then place their names on the manila folder, and they carry these cards around with them in class, including when they give their speeches, so other students can refer to them by name, heightening the reality of the simulation. Within the game, there's also lots of secret work by students, and I allow their thinking to come through in a journal. For some students, they're in a position of weakness where they might be limited on what they can say and what they can do. To protect them, I allow for the journal entry that gives me an insight to what they're thinking and how they're planning to get out of the situation or improve the situation that they're in. I also am well aware of what students are responsible for by creating cheat sheets for all of the role goals. The example that you have in front of you is from a game involving the Mexican Revolution. And you can see on the left-hand side that there are individuals' names and then the amount of influence that they have and particular roles or key aspects of their character that they are to bring to the forefront. By having this in my possession, I'm better able to counsel students on what they should do next, or if the game is going off track, I can adjust it and help students get back on track as well. Finally, I want to show you some aids that I created for students. There's frequently some mechanisms in the game that are very difficult to oversee and sometimes confuse students. One of these half the conference is experiencing in the American Revolution game with riots. And so I wanted to show you an example of something that I give to students that are organizing the rioting. I hand this to the group that is rioting, and it gives them very specific things that they need to address before they conduct their riot. In the next slide, I go out in the hallway and I help the student that is the victim of the riot by outlining what their options are. I then leave that student alone, let them make their decision, and go back in and work with the group that is creating the riot. All of these are aids that allow me to keep track of class activity. In the final slide, I also show you certificates that I've created that allow me during the game that is moving fast. It allows for students to give me certificates. You'll see that they all mimic money from different eras. And on these certificates, I allow students to write their real name, their character's name, whether they're in the early or late session, and then what their contribution was in class. Students hand these to me, and essentially I stuff them in my pockets while the simulation is going on, and it helps me to organize students, particularly to differentiate between those early and late sessions. By the end of the game, you'll be exhausted, and once again, this is in the best possible sense, but all of the student work will be done. The journal, the portfolio is done, and Canvas even keeps track of the dates so that I can see the students' activities over time. Now that's my best advice for the nuts and bolts of running a reacting class, and I'm more than happy to discuss other aspects later. But I want to turn to the second point of my address that looks at the power of reacting in your learning community. First, let me try and outline the problem as I see it, maintaining choice in a civil society, and then explain possibly how reacting will help. In The Breach, we like to say that higher education's call is to create future leaders for our society. And the unstated assumption is that educated, degree-holding people are really good at running society. As an undergraduate, I assumed this was true too. I assumed that universities were the best-run institutions, that academics always treated their colleagues respectfully, carefully weighed arguments, and arrived at wise decisions that would, in the long run, work. I can only assume that there's a slight chuckle in the room at my naive attitude, because we know that that's not true. Just like in real life, there's petty arguments, turf wars, money, and lots of factors come in on decisions. And sometimes those decisions are really bad. This is part of history. Another unstated assumption in academia is that most problems are an issue of technical expertise. Lots of articles and late-night talk show hosts have fun poking fun at citizens who don't know a particular fact or detail. And sometimes it can even take an intellectual turn. On September 27th of this year, the New York Times ran an op-ed by a professor called The Dying Art of Disagreement. And in this piece, he worried about the increasing attachment to political viewpoints as a substitute for some sort of civil morality. I quote, "We disagree about racial issues, bathroom policies, healthcare laws, and of course the 45th president. We express our disagreements in radio and cable TV rants in ways that are increasingly virulent. Streets and campus protests are increasingly violent, and personal conversations that are increasingly embittering." Now, I agree that in the best of all worlds, we could disagree more agreeably. Some would call this civic debate. But the op-ed makes the assertion, and I quote, the crucial prerequisite of intelligent disagreement, namely, shut up, listen up, pause and reconsider, and only then speak, is absent. Is this our modern world? For our students, whose prime experience in life, their great global historical event was the economic crash of 2008 and 2009, they have seen repeated groups violate this order. The Tea Party, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter. 2 years ago in Oregon, we had the Malheur takeover, the Women's March, the March for Science, neo-Nazi protests in Charlottesville, and even NFL protests. Now, I'm filming this on Monday, so I don't know what has happened between now and when you're viewing this, but I think one element that we can agree upon is that we would like to see more patterns of disagreement, more training, so that students know how to handle disagreement. Reacting to the past provides some of that training. And my big question is this part of a refocusing of securing a legacy of choice through civic engagement? I agree that universities are educating future leaders. But my question is, what type of leaders are we creating? Is it a leadership that believes knowledge alone in their field is enough? We've all had students that come to our office with the version of the question or statement, tell me what I need to know for the class. That's not enough. Just because some people have some facts doesn't mean that they will arrive at the same decision. We need to cultivate greater wisdom in discussion. In the surveys that I give after running Reacting to the Past, many students agree that they started the simulations thinking that a broad education outside of their field was of limited use. One student wrote in his reflection, before the simulation I thought history was just one event after the next. In other words, his solution was we needed more technical experts, more facts. My wife is fond of saying that knowledge is knowing a tomato is a fruit, but wisdom is not putting a tomato in a fruit salad. We do not need more technical expertise. We need students to make connections. An engineering major echoed these comments when he said, I walked into class thinking that I just needed to get this class out of the way to fulfill the back core. These students' comments show that disconnected knowledge in our society and the idea of applying critical thinking in the liberal arts wasn't part of their way of thinking before reacting to the past. But their thoughts changed. That student who believed that history was just one darn thing after another continued, I now know that many events can lead to one event, or vice versa, that history's jumbled up mixture of many events simultaneously occurring. The student who walked into class thinking that he just wanted to fulfill his back core, he found that this class became one of my favorite and most enjoyable classes. And even a computer science major noted that I initially believed that STEM courses were the most rigorous, but I realized that all coursework at the college level requires hard work, including history. The students found something beyond technical expertise in their classes. I want to be clear that I'm glad that we have different academic areas with different knowledge and wisdom. But at some point, shouldn't a student's education include the opportunity to practice the skills necessary to participate freely in a civic society? I suppose I should be clear about the word civic. Civic relates to the duties or activities of people in their local community. Now, civic is the older version of civil. In fact, originally civic was a garland of oak leaves and acorns given in ancient Rome to a person who saved their fellow citizen's life. And I think that's where we get to the point of what do we do in a crisis? How do we save our fellow citizens' lives? We all know that history provides turning points that will come to our society when our students and ourselves will be asked to choose sides. How are we training them to make that choice? How are we training them to make that participatory decision? I've gone quite a while without mentioning reacting to the past. One of the beauties of these simulations is that they are indefinite. Games are designed around turning points in history, although the topics have a great deal of variety. The way the games are designed is to have students address tough decisions and complex situations as a character with a particular point of view that immerses them in a different era. The game allows for students to try on different leadership styles. Now, I only run one game per term in each class, but students have the opportunity to take classes multiple times, and they've commented to me that this is one of the things they find enjoyable, is that they get better at leadership throughout the terms. One type of character that is written in reacting games is what I'll call the one-trick pony. This is a student who has one goal. The student comes off as self-assured, confident, and kind of a I alone can solve this problem type of person. But over the course of the game, that student finds that leadership style constraining them, and if they are to be successful in the game, they may have to make adjustments. Now, the second type of character in reacting to the past games is a student that has objectives that cannot be easily met. These students have to build bridges to get things done. At some point, the student faces the reality that they can't meet all of their goals. What are they willing to surrender to accomplish something greater? Is their victory an individual goal of independence or an exercising of a particular right? Or is their goal part of a factional goal where duty, responsibility, or altruism plays a role? The point is that students have to make choices and then deal with the future consequences of their actions. I'd like to give a couple of examples. I had a student who was assigned to be an abolitionist, and indeed as a modern person was offended by the very presence of slavery in that historical era. They did everything they could to block slavery. But they found in the context of that time that they had no wiggle room. And so she started weakening the boundaries of slavery by studying Southern anti-slavery advocates. She bent her arc of justice in the 5 class sessions. And it was good practice. Sometimes there's unintended consequences. For example, during a riot, a crowd thought that they would cower a victim, and so they issued a death threat, thinking that it wouldn't be used because the player would back down. The player stood firm, lectured the crowd on how they had abandoned their own values, and in the ensuing dice roll, the victim was killed. As the student walked back to the back of the classroom, the rioters shook his hand. In this example, the crowd exercised its power and in some ways regretted the event. Where else can you get that type of interaction that allows students to make a choice, see the result, and then possibly modify their behavior as part of a group? I've seen it go the other way with writers too. A group will sometimes go wild attacking others, some of whom have no connection to the issue that they are upset about. The rest of the class takes steps to stop this behavior. And I hope I'm not giving anything away, but that class was the only class in my experience where no vote took place on the Declaration of Independence because the patriots were shut down for this behavior. There's also funny moments. I love it when a character is getting the vote that they want, they're on the verge of a victory, and then they interrupt their ally because of a technical point, and it starts an argument with that ally. This is a classic example of technical expertise will not always save you. These simulations have boundaries, but the choices are a microcosm of real life, of what our students will face in the future years. Reacting to the past has allowed me to fulfill my curricular goals and expand students' value of history. Students have commented, I like everything. I like the debates and being able to view history in the context of it happening right now. This was my favorite course all term. A geology major agreed. This course was like nothing I've ever taken before. The public engagement and debate was a blast. But although students agree that they enjoy the courses, we need to allow students to practice that other art that they need with their knowledge, and that is that art of civic wisdom. Let's allow students to practice negotiating, working on a team, and even speaking to an unsympathetic audience. All of these are the hardest part keeping democracy alive in a republic. It's fair to say there's never been a time in U.S. history without protest, reform, and unrest. Sometimes the opposition implies that that reform and unrest impinges on the unity of the nation, or it implies that the protest is misguided and any risk of violence is un-American or wrong. While protests have made changes in society, we should all remember that complete victory by any one group has proven to be elusive. Great changes in society has required a leadership that communicated a vision and built bridges. Whether it's Abraham Lincoln during the most bloody war in our nation's history, Susan B. Anthony acquiring the right to vote for women, Linus Pauling trying to limit the proliferation of nuclear weapons, Martin Luther King Jr. and the issue of human rights, or Gloria Steinem and control over our bodies. All of these leaders were and will continue to be controversial. Their initial positions were unpopular, and in the future may grow in unpopularity. We don't know. But they took principled stands, and they risked violence against themselves, in some cases with others. In the past 3 weeks, 3 prominent politicians have used the word civic. George W. Bush had an interesting comment in his talking about civic life. He said, disagreement escalates sometimes into dehumanization, and too often we judge other groups by the worst examples while judging ourselves by our best intentions. Reacting to the past is an antidote to that, because students need to listen to their fellow students and form judgments. They have to decide whether they should act or whether they should not act. Should they cooperate with others or should they try and go it alone? And how far am I willing to take that risk? We can practice this wisdom in a place that allows for a set of individual choices, but it demands awareness of the context of the person's actions and others. And quite frankly, where the outcome is not as catastrophic as it was for some people who existed at the time. I deeply appreciate your patience with my presentation, and I look forward to our discussion. Please bear with us for a few moments while we get the technology ready for our discussion.